The fight scenes in Gladiator are epic. And who could forget the dominance of Achilles against Boagrius? But still, I don't think these guys have anything on David's mighty men. I mean, take Benaiah, for example. This guy killed 3 lions. One of them, it says, in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. And then the guy goes and takes down an Egyptian giant with only his walking stick. And then this guy, Josheb, do you see that spear he's holding? Well, in a single battle, he is going to kill 800 Philistines with that spear. I mean, this is like Samson status. And finally, Eleazar, this jolly looking fellow, well, he will fight off an entire Philistine army. When the rest of the Israelites fled in retreat, he holds his ground and he's hacking away at them for so long, it says, that his hand stuck to his sword. After the battle, they had to pry his fingers off. So what's the point of these stories? What do they contribute to the message of 1st and 2nd Samuel? Now, they may read like fun, action-packed hero stories, but their function in the narrative of 1st and 2nd Samuel is actually surprisingly tragic. You see, the author is going to emphasize their strength in order to highlight David's weakness. His mighty men are made to look big so that David looks small. Now, in this video, we are going to examine the role of David's mighty men in 1st and 2nd Samuel using this chart. Now, my name is also David, and I have made hundreds of charts like this to help me teach the Bible as a missionary in the Philippines. Now, you can download this chart in the description below, and then like and subscribe, and we can dive into 1 Samuel. So where are these mighty men in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel anyways? Well, here they are all the way at the end of 2nd Samuel, chapters 21 and 23. Now these 2 books together, 1st and 2nd Samuel, tell the story of the rise and fall of Israel's first 2 kings. Now Saul's story begins in chapter 8 when Israel impertinently asks for a king. You remember that? Here in chapter 8, the Israelites come to Samuel and they say, "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." And God tells Samuel, okay, obey the voice of the people, but know that they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Well, despite this, Saul's monarchy actually begins pretty well. He is going to go up from his hometown in Gibeah up to Jabesh-Gilead here in chapter 11, where he will defeat the Ammonite army which is besieging this city and their king, Nahash. Now this is kind of fun. The name Nahash is the same Hebrew word here in chapter 11 for the word snake. Nahash is snake or serpent. So Saul is going to crush the head of a snake, which is in the Promised Land garden. However, this new Adam will have his Genesis 3 fall moment here in chapter 13, where he is told to wait until Samuel arrives before offering the sacrifice. But because his army is fleeing from him, Saul goes ahead and offers the sacrifice himself. His problem here in chapter 13 is that he does not keep the commandment of Yahweh. You have not kept what Yahweh commanded you. And then again, here in chapter 15, this time, Saul does not listen to the words of Yahweh. You have not obeyed my voice. You have not shamad. I told you to devote the Amalekites to destruction, but rather you listened to the voice of the people, and you spared Agag, and you spared the best of the sheep and oxen. You see, the problem with Saul from the very beginning is that he was the people's choice and not God's choice. And that distinction is present even in the name Saul itself. Saul's name in Hebrew is pronounced Shaul, and that's based on the root word sha'al, which means to ask for. And Samuel, he's going to warn the people twice in his 2 covenant speeches here in chapter 8 and chapter 12. He tells them, "In that day, Israel, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves." And then again in chapter 12, another warning in verse 17, "You shall know that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking, in Sha'al, in asking for a king for yourself." Now it is God's turn to choose, and he will choose a man after his own heart, a shepherd from Bethlehem, David. Now Saul, he was afraid when he had 3,000 men at his back, but David, he will step on the battlefield all by himself against the giant with nothing but a sling and a stone. However, David's successes do nothing but stir up Saul's murderous jealousy, and after a couple of missed spears, David is forced to go on the run, where he will be for the rest of 1 Samuel, on the edge of death, first up at Nob, and then he flees to Philistine Gath and down to Moab before returning to the wilderness of Judea, where he will spare Saul's life twice. The point is that God's chosen king will wait patiently for God to exalt him without stretching out his hand to take the throne for himself. And this is actually one of the many ways that the David narrative anticipates the Messiah and his own humble beginnings. But David will be exalted here in 2 Samuel 5 through 9, where he is made king over all Israel and Judah, and God enters into a covenant with him and his descendants forever, a covenant which will culminate in the Messiah. Now these chapters, 5 through 9, are the high point of the whole book. But then, tragically, David will have his own fall moment in 2 Samuel chapter 11, the fall of David, adultery and murder. And the author of Samuel is going to model the sin of David based on the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. Take a look at this. Pay attention to these key words, which are going to be repeated in the Adam and Eve narrative and in the David narrative as well. So the woman, she will see that the tree is good, and so she takes of its fruit and with her husband realizes that she is naked. That same sequence of words we see in the fall of David's story in 2 Samuel 11, where David will see that Bathsheba is good, so he takes her and then becomes naked. He lays with her. Now, the prophet Nathan, he will tell David that because of this sin, the sword will never depart from your house, David, and God tells him, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. Now, of course, this evil will take the form of Absalom, who will force David to go on the run in the wilderness again. Now, these final chapters in 2 Samuel will portray David as a sad and a broken man, which takes us to the final section in 2 Samuel with David's mighty men. Now, these chapters, 21 to 24, are arranged as a chiasm, beginning and ending with a sin of Saul and a sin of David, resulting first in a 3-year famine and then a 3-day plague. After this, we have the 2 accounts of David's mighty men in 21 and 23, and at the center, we have 2 poems, 2 songs, both of which with messianic significance. Let's turn now to David's mighty men. Now, up to this point, David has been a one-man show, but after he has been humbled in chapter 11, we learn about all the soldiers who have been fighting alongside him the entire time. It turns out David isn't the only giant slayer, but here in chapter 21, we learn about 4 others who also slayed giants. Now, the giant who Elhanan took down here in chapter 21, a giant of Gath, he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. I mean, I doubt Goliath had 24 digits like this guy. But David's most renowned heroes were part of 2 distinguished groups, either the 30 or the 3. Now, Josheb, you remember him, he took down 800 Philistines with a spear. And Eleazar, he's the guy that we had to pry the sword out of his hand. So let's add them up. We have 4 giant slayers and then 3 army killers, followed by 2 wonder workers. You remember Benaiah is the one who killed the lions, followed by the 30 elite soldiers who made David's army unstoppable. But again, what's the point of these little mini battle vignettes? And for that, we are going to get help from an Old Testament scholar, John Sailhammer. He explains that the focus on their exploits, the mighty men, rather than on David's, appears to push David out of center stage. This focus on their strength functions to highlight David's weakness. And therefore, in each of the mighty men stories in chapter 21 and 23, we have an embedded narrative about David's weakness, that he needs help. So take a look at chapter 21, where we read that David was weary, and he would have been killed by this giant Ishbenob if Abishai did not come to his rescue. David wasn't strong enough to take on this giant. He needed help from Abishai. And then again, in chapter 23, David will say longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well that is in Bethlehem." David is not strong enough to recapture his own hometown. But the three mighty soldiers, the three mighty men, they're strong enough. It says that they were able to break through the camp of the Philistines, draw water, and take it to David. Returning to Sailhammer, we see how these stories of the mighty men in chapters 21 and 23 anticipate David's final sin in the last chapter of the book. So Sailhammer says that these mighty men stories prepare the way for a view of David who has lost his confidence in God, but instead begins to rely on his own strength. Remember, in the last chapter of the book, we have David's census of the strength of his army. And then he continues that it can hardly be accidental that the list of the mighty warriors of the 30 in chapter 23 is going to end with the name Uriah. And thus, we are brought back to David's first failure as an introduction to his last failure. However, this last failure of David will be atoned for at the future location of the temple, when David will intercede for the people and offer his life in their place. You see, we need a king like David, who's after God's own heart. Yes, but we need a greater than David Messiah who will offer his sinless life as an atonement for his people. We need a king who will not rise and fall like David, but one who will only rise and reign in perfect righteousness forever. Now, the book of Psalms, it's going to tell this same story of the rise and the fall of the Davidic monarchy. And it's going to offer the same hope of a future coming king who will restore the kingdom to Israel. Now, if you want to see how all 150 Psalms tell that same story, you should check out this next video.